plea for peace. Pope Francis prays for God's intervention in the military conflict in Ukraine. Calling on the U.S. Ukraine's president speaks directly to Congress, asking for help. Fighting inflation. Analysis of how the Federal Reserve is responding to rising prices in the United States. And the People's House. We report on the plans to reopen the U.S. Capitol. On EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, March 16th, 2022. Thank you so much for being with us tonight on this feast of St. John de Brebeuf. I'm Tracy Sable. Pope Francis makes an appeal for prayers, asking for peace and forgiveness amid the pain of war.
Signore Gesù, nato sotto le bombe di Kiev.
The Holy Father invited Christians today to pray for an end to the crisis in Ukraine. He recited a prayer saying in part, quote, "Forgive us for war, O Lord, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on us sinners. Lord Jesus, born in the shadows of bombs falling on Kyiv, have mercy on us." Pope Francis also discussed the military conflict with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Holy Father and Patriarch Kirill met over a video conference call. They held what officials called, quote, a detailed discussion of the situation on Ukrainian soil. They also examined ways both churches can improve the humanitarian situation. Patriarch Kirill is the head of roughly 90 million Russian Orthodox faithful. On the government level, officials from Ukraine and Russia both say progress is being made during talks to end the violence. Sergei Lavrov called the negotiations, quote, businesslike, adding a neutral military status for Ukraine is being discussed. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says the discussions are, quote, realistic. But for now, the bombing in Ukraine's capital city continues, as well as in other parts of the country. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy tells U.S. lawmakers in a live stream speech this morning, quote, "We need you right now."
Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people, whether Ukrainians will be free, whether they will be able to preserve their democracy.
Speaking through an interpreter, President Zelenskyy compared Russia's invasion to the U.S. experiences of Pearl Harbor and September 11th. He accused Russia of attacking Western values. He requested a humanitarian no-fly zone, as well as additional defensive military assistance to protect his people. A few hours after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy spoke to Congress, President Joe Biden announced $800 million more to help Ukraine. It arrives in the form of more military aid. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Tracy, President Joe Biden said he listened to President Zelenskyy's speech this morning from his private residence, and he called his message passionate, convincing, and significant. And later, President Biden said he believes Vladimir Putin is a war criminal.
President Joe Biden reveals new plans to help Ukraine.
The American people are answering President Zelensky's call for more help, more weapons for Ukraine to defend itself, more tools to fight Russian aggression.
The suffering caught on camera, this hospital in Ukraine overflowing with victims. President Biden promises more aid.
An additional $800 million in assistance. That brings the total of new U.S. security assistance to Ukraine to $1 billion just this week.
Also today, in a high-level engagement between the U.S. and Russia, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan spoke by phone with the Secretary of the Russian Security Council.
The White House says Jake Sullivan warned Russia about the consequences and implications of any possible Russian decision to use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. While that was taking place, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was meeting with NATO leaders in Europe.
We remain united in our support of Ukraine, and we condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion into Ukraine.
And separately today, President Biden held an event marking the renewal of the Violence Against Women Act, which he first introduced over 30 years ago as a senator. The goal of the act is reducing domestic and sexual violence.
The vast majority of children on the street with their mothers are there because she's a victim of domestic violence.
The law calls for more police training, crisis intervention, and legal assistance to victims.
Also today, the World Health Organization pleaded with Russia to stop attacking Ukrainian hospitals and healthcare facilities. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
And joining me now is Clare Lopez, founder and president of Lopez Liberty, LLC. Clare, welcome back. Always so good to see you. As Owen just reported, President Biden is sending an additional $800 million to Ukraine for weapons and defense. Included in that package are 800 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, 2,000 Javelin missiles, and 100 grenade launchers, just to name a few. What are your thoughts on this assistance package? Do you think it's enough, Clare?
I think that the Ukrainians are going to continue to need a steady supply of these kinds of defensive weapons, whether they come from the United States or other places. But I will add that one of the most significant apparent additions to that defensive package, not exactly defined specifically, but some kind of air defense system for Ukraine, perhaps something like the S-300 system, which would be extremely useful, and I think even more useful than planes like those MiG-29s from Poland.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. We talked about that last week, and now that's not included, the MiG-29s. Why do you think that is? Why is that not being a consideration?
Well, because of the transfer mechanism, how that would work. The Poles are perfectly willing to supply these 28 MiG-29s, but they didn't want to send them directly from their territory into Ukrainian territory, proposed that they go by way of Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. The United States did not want to do that either, called it escalatory, that these would be coming directly from NATO countries. Not quite sure what the difference is between the kind of lethal aid promised today, but honestly, I do think that an air defense system like the S-300, if that's what it is, would be more effective in protecting the Ukrainians and especially civilian areas from aerial assault by the Russians.
We also mentioned that President Zelenskyy, as you know, spoke to Congress this morning, of course, pleading for help for his country. Again, he specifically requested a no-fly zone. We talked about this as well and the implications of this last week. That said, do you think it's now something that may be considered in light of current developments?
No, I don't. And I think that we see the alternatives being offered in the package that we've just spoken about, that President Biden noted in his comments today. I know that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, who spoke to the U.S. Congress this morning, asked again for aerial no-fly zone. But I reiterate, I think that an aerial defense system, an air defense system, could be as effective, perhaps more effective, even than jets in the sky doing aerial combat. I think an air defense system is really what's needed, and if that's what's in the package on its way, I think that could be very helpful, especially in defending civilian areas.
Yeah, Clare, something else I want to talk about. U.S. and also NATO officials both warned that Russia may launch a false flag operation involving chemical or biological weapons. I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And if that were to happen, what type of response do you think that should render?
Well, the United States has been I guess, revealing intelligence gleaned from their collection methods for a while now, which in some way I think is helping to kind of preempt the Russians from actually deploying those kinds of attacks. I don't expect to see chemical or biological weapons attacks, false flag or otherwise, by the Russians. But a part of that might be that the United States has just outed that intelligence publicly.
Well, Claire, so much more we can talk about. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much, as always, for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Coming up, analysis of rising inflation in the United States and whether it will end anytime soon. Oh, there will be a new campus ministry leadership at the Catholic University of America. The Dominicans will succeed the conventional Franciscans this summer. Outgoing President John Garvey says, quote, the Dominicans bring with them a rich heritage of scholarship and spiritual guidance, and as our neighbors, they are well acquainted with the university and its mission. The Federal Reserve is hiking interest rates for the first time since 2018. The 0.25 percentage point rate increase is meant to help ease inflation, which is now at its highest level in 40 years. Joining us now is Joel Griffith, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Joel, welcome back. So great to see you.
Hey, thank you, Tracy. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about this rate hike and ultimately how is it going to impact our pocketbooks?
Well, the American family is being impacted already even before this rate hike, and that's in large part because we saw our government suppressing our economy, criminalizing businesses from operating, and then you had the Federal Reserve print trillions of dollars to fund our government operations. So there's no easy way out of this. If the money continues to flow, we end up with higher inflation. If the Federal Reserve tries to rein in some of that lending, well, we're going to have an economic slowdown. There's no easy way out. The federal government, hand in hand with the Federal Reserve, created this problem, and now we are all literally paying for it.
Yeah, I want to talk about also another thing, this shifting the economic growth outlook, lowering it to about 2.8% from 4% that was projected back in December. Break that down for us. What does that mean to us?
For us, it shouldn't come as a surprise. When you have the government involved in so many aspects of our economy and regulating it because of COVID initially, and now you have the Biden administration putting in place a slew of regulations in every sector of the economy, and then you compound that with the fact that the Biden administration is putting in place regulations on our energy sector that will ensure that our supply will be limited in years to come, it's no surprise that now these forecasts for economic growth are being lowered. Families are already feeling this. If you're earning a living, you're probably realizing that your wages are buying far less than they did a year ago. Economists are just coming around to recognizing this damage that's already being done.
Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this before. You just go to fill up your car and you get hit pretty hard now.
My little Honda Accord, it's costing me about $75 to fill up, and I really feel for these families that are running kids back and forth to school and work. These families are spending hundreds of dollars a month now in additional fuel costs. And if you're a typical family, let's say you're earning $70,000 between a husband and a wife, this jump in the cost of living is costing you to the tune of $600 extra a month. I know most people are feeling it, and sadly, most families' wages are not keeping up with this jump in the cost of living.
Yeah, absolutely. Gas, and then of course that also impacts your budget when it comes to buying food as well.
Well, food costs, if you can find the food that you're looking for, especially if you're trying to eat healthy, a lot of these veggies you can't even find on the shelves right now, but food costs too are jumping, and with what's happening across the oceans in Ukraine and Russia, things might get even worse as our food supply across the world is partially dependent on that region, of course.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about that and ask you about that. You know, I've heard that Russia is halting its exports of fertilizer, and many farmers here are saying, well, that's going to impact us, and ultimately that's going to impact you and I and everyone else at the grocery store. Explain that to us.
Yeah, so when we talk about growing our food, a big part of that, the reason why food has become so much more affordable over the generations is because we have fertilizer. Our yields are far higher now than they were before. Well, Russia is the world's leading exporter of fertilizer. About 13% of the world's exports come from Russia, and farmers are realizing fertilizer costs are actually up about 140% in just the past year or so. And sadly, we've made matters worse here in the United States over the years because we have so many environmental restrictions in place. It makes us an importer of the fertilizer products that we could be producing here at home. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, our government has in place in the United States a fertilizer tax where we levy tariffs that are paid by farmers and ultimately by us when we go to the grocery store. We levy these tariffs on fertilizer. It's time for our government to get with it, roll back some of these environmental regulations, allow us to produce more of the fertilizer we need. The last thing we should be dependent on Russia on is fertilizer for our crops.
And Joe, I want to ask you this, if you can touch on this. If this crisis in Ukraine, if this continues to go on any longer, how might that impact our economy, down the road?
Well, a big part of this issue with Russia invading Ukraine has to do with the energy markets. Now, thankfully, as a country, in 2020 and 2021, we actually were a net oil exporter for the first time since 1949, largely in part because of the pro-energy policies of President Trump. And that meant that we could actually help Europe as well. Europe is importing a lot more U.S. natural gas, about twice as much as they were just a year ago. And that's thanks to the unleashing of our energy sector over the years. When you see Russia invading Ukraine and these sanctions being put in place and the disturbances of the energy markets, even though we're energy independent here, our allies overseas, because they're dependent on Russian oil, they have to get that energy from somewhere, and that's why you saw these prices surge. And until Europe gets with it as well and unleashes their energy sector and stops their dependency on Russian oil imports, that's a threat to their prosperity, our prosperity, and world security. So
we're running out of time. A big question now, it's in a lot of people's minds right now. Are we heading towards a recession?
I think regardless of whether or not we end up in a recession, which is 2 quarters of negative economic growth, even if we don't end up in a technical recession, families are getting hurt right now. We have millions fewer people working today than just a few years ago. And probably even more importantly, we know that the average family is seeing a decline in their standard of living because of inflation. Whether or not we end up shrinking as far as a national economy, the bottom line is families are feeling the pain right now.
Yeah, well, Joel, thank you as always for coming on. Wish we had better news to talk about, but hopefully next time.
Hey, thank you, Tracy.
Okay, thanks so much, Joel. Well, the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a measure that would make daylight saving time permanent. Republican Senator Marco Rubio from Florida sponsored the Sunshine Protection Act. He says that he doesn't know if the House will take it up or if President Biden will sign it into law. Well, it has been nearly 2 years since the U.S. Capitol complex that is closed to the public because of the COVID pandemic, but that may be about to change. Congressional officials are reviewing a plan for a phased reopening beginning in less than 2 weeks. All right, here is the tentative plan. On March 28th, limited school tours in-house and Senate office buildings, as well as staff-led tours resume. On May 30th, Memorial Day, a limited reopening of the Capitol Visitor Center. Around Labor Day weekend, operations return to pre-pandemic levels with a full reopening of the U.S. Capitol for tours. The announcement can't come too soon for many lawmakers who have been pushing for a reopening.
I mean, this is the people's house. We're having people standing outside getting cold or hot, depending on the weather outside, to be able even to come in to visit with us in our office buildings, but they can't go to the Capitol. They can't sit in the gallery.
Well, the reopening plan has not yet been finalized. A lot depends on Capitol Police staffing levels to handle more visitors. Up next, reflecting on democracy at a challenging moment in history. Japan plans to fully lift its coronavirus restrictions on Monday.
各知事の要請を踏まえ
Japan's prime minister made the announcement today, noting lower infection rates and fewer cases due to the Omicron variant. The most recent restrictions were imposed in January. Once lifted, Japan will allow more domestic travel, but will not yet open its border for international tourism. A Vatican university is set to host a 3-day meeting on the importance of democracy. Educating for Democracy in a Fragmented World begins tomorrow in Rome. Pope Francis will meet with participants on Friday at the Vatican. The initiative began in 2018 and has been hosted by more than a dozen universities. Joining us now from Rome is Monsignor Guy-Real Thivierge, Secretary General for the Pontifical Foundation on Education. Monsignor, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. Can you tell us more about these meetings that are starting tomorrow? How many people are taking part, and also where are they from?
Yes, this is a very important meeting for us because it is absolutely right in the objectives of our foundation. The title of the meeting is Education to Democracy in a Fragmented World. So today, more than ever, many of our democracies are not necessarily functioning very well. And at the same time, some of our democracies have to be rethought. So the idea is to think, to analyze the situation of various democracies in the world, in 14, together with 14 universities, in 13 different countries, in almost all the parts of the world. So we try to understand better what is going on with the democracies on the very aspects from the cultural point of view, social, political, economic, and then we try to detect exactly which are, I would say, which are the positive answers and then the negative answer, the negative points. So the idea is to make sure that we have a good diagnosis of the situation, and then we try to propose some formations just to make sure that we will be able to help the younger generations to have a positive look on the democracy. So this is basically what we are doing. That project started about 3 years ago. So it is really, it is a process. It is a process. So that the meeting that is the Congress that is starting tomorrow is one important step of that process.
Well, Monsignor, we have probably about a minute left or so in the interview. But quickly, I'm curious, in what sorts of ways does democracy have a religious meaning?
Yeah, democracy means living together in better conditions. So when we are thinking of living, of trying to live together in better conditions, first and foremost, the full respect of the human dignity is a basis. Then fraternity, justice, common good are basic ingredients of a real fraternity. So if we want to build a real fraternity, if we want to build a better world where we can live together with all our brothers and sisters, it is important to reflect on democracy. So from that point of view, democracy has a real important religious meaning. And what does the teaching, the social teaching of the church do? I mean, these are the basic ingredients of the social doctrine of the church. So it has a direct relation with the religions, with Christianity, with Catholicism, but also other religions. It's extremely important.
Well, Monsignor, thank you so much for your time today and speaking with us. We really appreciate it. And finally tonight, amid all the concern and anxiety around us, Pope Francis offers a reminder of the hope and inspiration that we can receive from the elderly.
Non dimentichiamo che noi avevamo la possibilità della saggezza.
At his weekly talk to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father notes the elderly can guide and save future generations, and following their wisdom should become the mission of us all. And we thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.